A bestial, degraded, and subhuman cult. Sir Evelyn Baring, Governor of Kenya. Hi, my name is Ngina.
And I'm Mahak.
And we are the Disruptors. And welcome to Season 2, The Hanged. Just a trigger warning to our listeners and those watching. This episode is going to be covering a little bit of abuse and torture. Listener discretion is advised. So let's take it back to the beginning. Mahak.
It's 1952, October. A general Kikuyu loyalist gets into his lovely Hudson sedan and is going for a drive, basically. It turns out to be a normal day, at least for him for a few minutes, until he gets stopped by a few people in police uniforms. And when asked whether Chief Waruhiu is in the car, he says, "Yes, I'm here." No sooner had he finished his sentence, a gun went off. The chief was killed, and the men left the scene. Turns out they were members of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, also called Mau Mau by the white settlers, who had ambushed and killed the prominent loyalist. And this would set off a series of intense change within Kenyan colonial history. But it comes at a very funny time. Kenya had just gotten a new governor, who Ngina had just mentioned, Sir Evelyn Baring, 10 days before this very, very gruesome murder. He was shot in his mouth, by the way. And he was only one shot. Despite having his driver there, no one was caught. And this throws newly minted Governor of Kenya, Sir Evelyn Baring, into a very, very hot situation. So let's go a bit back. 10 days prior, Sir Evelyn Baring lands in Kenya. He is a little bit of a backstory about the guy, just so you understand where he's also coming from. His father was known as the maker of modern Egypt, Lord Cromer. Although he didn't really know his father, his father was like in his 60s when Evelyn was born. And he was in his teens by the time his father died, and he had spent all his time in colonial missions. But Baring spent most of his life trying to pretty much emulate his father's ways. Beliefs, yeah. You can say that. So he comes into colonial Kenya, 1950s, the settlers are pissed off. There is a lot of, I would say, at that point, they would have described it as tiffs between the locals and the white settlers in different areas.
Protests.
However, Baring was not made aware of how bad the situation was.
Yeah.
Right? His predecessor pretty much was like, I want a clean record because I'm getting a retirement. I want my pension. You deal with this yourself. So when Baring comes in, he's actually met with a huge folder of actually what's going on. And it turns out that things are not looking that great on ground at all. So just before Waruhiu's murder, there was actually reports of a lot of tension between the white settlers and the slowly but quickly mobilizing Kenya Land and Freedom Army. There was a lot of tension also between those who were agitating for change, not just within the around the highlands, but also within Nairobi at that point. And Baring finds himself stuck between, of course, the government, the Queen's government, and then the settlers here. The settlers in Kenya were very, very, and I have to emphasize on this, were very, very, I want to use a nice word.
Anti.
They were kind of just decisive. I'm going to leave it at that. They were very decisive. They really wanted things to be done in a certain way. So, and the reason for this is there were a lot of white settler deaths that had actually been plaguing people along the highlands.
Yeah.
And this actually was... So the first death that is actually recorded is somewhere in early October. So October 9 is when Chief Waruhiu is killed.
Yeah.
But early in October, there was actually a woman who was murdered at her farm. And a lot of people believe that that was one of the first early murders or the first early attacks by members of the Kenya Land Freedom Army on white settlers. And of course, the settlers were now feeling like, we live on these huge tracts of isolated land, sometimes close to forests where, it was known that there are people who are part of the army who are taking refuge in these forests. And we don't have landline connection. We don't have, there are not that many police stations in somewhere like Thompson Falls at that point, right? And this already this fear already pushes the settlers to take up a lot of matters in their own hands. And of course, the easiest target, the people who are violently asking for freedom. That's your scapegoat. Those are the people you go after. So when Baring comes in, he's taking into account all these things. Okay, yes, there's a murder that's happened on a settler property. There are settlers who are complaining about insecurity. There's a whole report about certain members of of the local indigenous population coming together to pretty much launch an attack on the Queen's government. So Baring's taking all this in, and what he decides to do is, yes, I'm getting all these reports, but I'm going to go on a tour, like some people. So yeah, at that time he didn't have a Land Rover, so I'm pretty sure he took those really fancy cars with the wheels. He probably was a Hudson, who knows. He takes his car, goes on a tour of majorly places with Kikuyu populations. So he would find himself going around Central. He was prominently noted when he went to Nyandarua, where he said that when I went there, and I'm paraphrasing what he said that a lot of faces that looked back at me looked angry. They were scowling at me, and they just looked like very angry individuals. And he says that was something he noticed or witnessed a lot during the early Mau Mau years. This is his quote. But what the funny part is, every time he went on these tours, never once did he meet the people who were scowling at him. Never once did he meet these people whose land was stripped away from them, whose titles were stripped away from them, who were being overworked and underpaid. Never did he sit down with them and listen to them and say, hey, tell me your grievances. Again, like some people, he only spoke to the Kikuyu chiefs, who, as we all know, are very, who would be termed as loyalists, basically, to the British government. He would talk to officers who were stationed at these places. And all he got back when he would talk to either the loyalists, either the other chiefs that were stationed there, or even settlers who were living there, was, we are having, quote unquote, a Mau Mau problem. We are having, quote unquote, a Kikuyu problem. And thus this reinforced Baring's idea that, yes, there is a Kikuyu problem in the highlands. And this gets worse when the chief is killed. So remember, we have the hierarchy kind of goes like, we of course have the colonial government, but how do you operate a colonial structure? How do you operate a colonial government? You can't have every single white person be everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. So they had infiltrated basically villages. They had promised chiefs that we'll give you land if you are loyal to us. And that's where, Chief Waruhiu was. He was a prominent loyalist. Like he was the British most favorite Kikuyu icon, at least at that time.
Yeah. And that's why they saw it as a direct attack.
So the moment he was killed, and that too in a very brutal way, because remember, he wasn't robbed. Neither were the people around him robbed in any way. His car wasn't taken. The people with him weren't killed. He was the only one killed. He was shot in his mouth.
To send a message.
And that message was heard loud and clear by the government. And what did they do? They retaliated with pretty much Operation Jock Scott, which would lead us to the emergency. So we've gone into the emergency before, and that's something that we've talked about. A general overview of how things started looking like in Kenya at that point was started rounding up anyone that was suspected of being Mau Mau. We all know that that's when the Kapenguria 6 were captured because they wanted to pin the blame on someone or the other. There's a very interesting anecdote whereby Baring actually bribes people to come and give false testimonies to build a case against the Sikhs. But at in the backdrop of the emergency, people being rounded up, and the Kapenguria Sikhs trial, there is a war that's being waged in the forest and in the highlands. So it's important to note how it was reacted upon. So we have the emergency that takes place.
Yeah.
And within a few months, a white man called Erskine Bauer, a World War II veteran, is murdered. His body is found disemboweled on his ranch. And due to the nature of his attack, which was termed as very gruesome, settlers completely and utterly pointed their fingers at the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, at the Mau Mau. They said there's no way this could have been done by just anyone. So that gets added on to a list of murders that continues. A week later, another elderly white settler couple who lived next to Thompson Falls and quite close to the forest, actually, quite close to the edge of the forest, are found murdered after having it's described as they were murdered after having their evening coffee. So they were murdered. And again, the gruesome nature at which they were hacked by machetes, according to reports by the police and the settlers at the time, also pointed fingers towards the Mau Mau. And then after that, a lot of people would remember the name of Mbotela.
Yeah.
He was appointed to Legco, and he was hated. He was African, but he was hated because he was clearly a puppet of the of the British government. His body was found at what was called the Burma Market. The Burma Market existed in honor of those who fought in the Burma campaign that we mentioned in episode 1. His body was found by a European settler who had gone to the market. Funny thing was, that morning, a lot of locals had passed that area and none of them saw his body. The only person who picked it up was a European settler. Again, it felt like a direct hit to the Queen's government. This is another person who is known to have positive sentiments towards the colonial government. He's found dead. That too in a market that has a huge significance, right? Later that day, on the day of his murder, the market is also burnt down.
Yeah.
It is alleged that the market was burnt down by police officers and other officials who were angered by the fact that the locals did not care much about Mbotela's death. So kind of a sort of a retaliation, right? And then comes one of the most gruesome murders of the Ruck family at that point. There was a family of 3, man, wife, son, who were brutally hacked by their own servants, by a group of their own servants, and who fled the crime scene. And the reason why this became one of the most sensational murders was this happened in January 24th of 1953. So this was, again, just at the backdrop of the Kapenguria trials. It was during a time when the case had been heard and it had been adjourned. So there was a lot of political tension already at this point. And then this murder takes place and it is sensationalized extremely. Journalistic practices, you don't really put out images of kids who've been gruesomely murdered. It's to protect the child as well. However, at that point, it was everywhere. In all the newspapers, to get a shock value, there was images of the little boy called Michael in his room, surrounded by bloody teddy bears.
Yeah.
And that got to the settlers the most because they realized these people who were the servants of this family went from being this very caring people, because there was a point where apparently a few days before the murder, Michael fell down while riding his pony. Very fancy white stuff going on here. But he was riding a pony, he fell down, he got hurt, and all their servants came and they picked this little kid up and they took him back and they nursed him to health. And then the same people who nursed him to health took away his life. So for the settlers, it was like they can go from being kind to gruesome so quickly. So that got the settlers like really riled up.
Yeah.
And it came to a point, where about 1,500 of them marched to Government House here in Nairobi. That time it was Evelyn Baring's offices. And they pretty much said, if you're not going to do anything, we are. There's a quote by one of the settlers who pretty much says to then Member of Parliament Michael Blunder, you will never be able to do away with the Kikuyu problem. Even if you try, it won't go away. It's better, and I'm paraphrasing, it's better to send in troops and shoot up all of them.
And troops were sent.
Exactly.
Troops were sent. Immediately, the state, this is happening with the Operation Jock's Court. All these things are happening hand in hand, and troops from all over are sent. So first of all, troops are sent from the UK itself. They also send troops from other African countries. Not necessarily white troops from these other countries, but basically like what happened, what we explained in episode 1, where Kenyans were being taken to Ethiopia, for example, to fight. So these troops were from other African countries, Egypt, Uganda, and Tanganyika, what we now know of today as Tanzania. And it gets heavy. So it's like an overnight thing, and their aim was to neutralize African political leadership. And apart from the Kapenguria 6 being arrested, they also banned the political parties, the ethnic political parties, like KAU. But what I find interesting is the idea they had this hope of, we're going to neutralize these guys. There won't be a war, basically. And the opposite happens. If anything, they're more riled up. The Kenya Land and Freedom Army are now charging. And they come to realize that what you've actually mentioned it just a few seconds ago, that they seem to be very nice, but can turn very quickly. So this turn is something they end up calling that it's a psychic issue. And they claim that this psychic issue comes in because of the oaths that the Kenya Land and Freedom Army were taking. Just to go into in depth with the oaths. So the oaths basically were there for total secrecy, obviously, loyalty to the cause. And it's actually believed that there were 7 stages of these oaths. And the 7th stage was the one where you're now willing to kill for the cause. So people like Dadan are believed to have taken all those oaths. Willing, and then obviously it was seen as communal unity. In my head, I feel like they were very threatened because they were shocked that these people there was this unity that they had not seen before. And it's a part of British propaganda that they were using. This idea of we're going to divide and conquer. So that's why we have the loyalists and home guards on one side, and the African people, basically the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. And it's something they even use all the way to the detention camps, which we're going to be speaking on later on. Basically, the setting of this oaths were obviously deep in the forests. The others that happened inside homes of trusted elders or oath administrators, often women. It's really key for us to note that women did play a very huge role in this. They were also administered in abandoned schools, farms, or under mugumo trees, which is sacred to the Kikuyu people. So there was this sense of it was seen as a spiritual movement. And I think that's something that also scared the white settlers. Anyway. So each item had a symbolic meaning tied to land, blood, and solidarity. So I'm going to mention a few items and the symbolism when it comes to these oaths. We've heard of goat blood or sheep blood, and the symbolism of it was life and unity. There's earth, soil, ancestral land, which is the connection to our land, something that is still deep to this day. We're very in tune with our nature and land. There's also animal intestines, and it being, there was a lot going on at these oaths. And so for them, these animal intestines, whenever they were tied, it was it was also a spiritual tie to the cause. And then, of course, there's the Mugumo tree bark, which is a sacred Kikuyu spirituality. There was Millet beer Muratina, which was seen as a communal blessing and truth. Then there's white chalk or ashes of, and it was a sign of purity and ancestral presence. And then what they used to hack most of these people when they were going to attack, the machetes. It symbolized a readiness to fight. And this whole thing also had a procedure, which we'll see how the British there's a way. The British basically at some point want to make these people denounce their oaths, and they actually have a whole process. It's very gruesome, but they believed it was very deep, so they also had to go very deep to denounce, for them to denounce this. And basically, the oathing procedure was purification, where they were anointed with water or chalk. Shoes were removed as a sign of humility. And then there's the invocation, of course, praying to spiritual leaders. And these prayers often involved curses on betrayal and blessings on loyalty. There's someone who actually says that if you dared go against the oath, even your shadow would be cast. It was that deep. Then, of course, there's a blood ritual. It's some sources do say that they dipped fingers or their tongues in blood, and sometimes it was mixed with soil and drunk or smeared across the chest. Then, of course, there's the oath recitation. I'm just going to read a bit of this oath. I swear I will never betray the Mau Mau. I will give all I have, life, land, strength, for freedom. If I betray, may I die like this goat. May my children and grandchildren perish. So some of these oaths now, like the seventh one is now when they start saying they promise to kill enemies, obey commanders, or never touch stolen land. The bit of stolen land stuck with me because later on we see it was the loyalists, and it's not even later on, we see that the loyalists and the chiefs are the ones who are being given this stolen land.
Yeah. And I think that's where the propaganda kind of takes effect, especially within the colonial government. As described how the oaths are to someone who is not conversant with spiritual practices, with what they mean. To them, this looks like witchcraft. This is what it is. And to the settlers, when they would hear about this, because the moment the colonial papers got their hand on this, it was everywhere. They would talk about it. So for them, it reinforced the fact that these people, number one, are savages. They need our help to be civilized. And that their practices make them far much more gruesome. So what happens is their practices overshadow or kind of bolster also what they needed or what they wanted was. I mean, all they were asking was for land and freedom, right? That was the basis of the whole movement. But the process in which they demanded loyalty, in which they ensured loyalty, and in which they meted out justice in their terms was something that the settlers could not imagine. And for them, it reinforced that belief that these people are savages, that these people are not someone that you can converse with, not people you can sit down and talk with. And that's why a lot of them firmly believed that the extermination of them, of these people, was very important.
And was warranted.
And warranted.
Yeah. Now, it goes deeper. The oaths get deeper. Sometimes they would swallow pieces of sacred plants, and of course, drinking the blood. Sometimes they would initiate, the initiates, each raw animal parts or touched genitalia to blood, symbolizing complete commitment. Those stages to these things. Now, the women Their oath was a bit different. For them, it focused on providing food, carrying intelligence, or initiating children into loyalty, which we saw what the Kenya Land and Freedom Army women did. For the children, it was very interesting. And they tapped into what children do. Children play. So they would take the oaths, obviously, but what they would be pushed to do is go play around, like go play around our masters. Listen to what they say and then come back and tell us what they have said. So they would use this as ways of getting information. Women too are used to get information from the white settler. So it's quite interesting to see that children also took oaths, and there's a role that they played. Now, of course, it being very deep, very spiritual, and it's something you've already mentioned. The oath was not only meant to give them a sense of loyalty, it was also meant to instill fear in them. As the army, it was also meant to instill fear in them, that they were actually told if you break the oath, it meant madness, disease, or death. Explains the story of the shadow.
Yes.
Yeah. And of course, you've already mentioned it, the propaganda that comes in because of that. First of all, the British wanted to paint this picture that we are very peaceful. Kenya is a land of gin slings and tropical climate and beautiful farms. We are basically another South Africa. But what was actually so what they did was paint the Mau Mau, even them giving them the name Mau Mau was British propaganda. And the other thing they did was paint this picture that they are terrorists, satanic, primitive, and barbaric. And so the detention camps that come in later on are basically to the oath, and we are trying to cleanse them so that they are able to go back into the communities as rehabilitated persons. Something to note is that, of course, we know the Kenya Land and Freedom Army was not only among the Kikuyu, there was the Meru, there was the Kamba, there was the Luo, and all these people, these regions, they had variations in their oaths.
Yes.
For example, the Meru, they used beaded charms and added local customs to their oath. That's just an example. Children were having their tongues anointed with blood and repeating family oaths. So this, in a sense, it started within the family. Yeah. And so with now Jock Scott coming in, the operation is underway. There's still murders going on. Obviously, the troops are in. What people need to note is that they painted the Kenya Land and Freedom Army as very violent beings. But all reports that we've looked at, they don't measure up with the kind of killing these British troops
meant out on them.
Yes. Yeah. And the kind of basically what they unleashed was not equal to what they told the rest of the world. And so in Nairobi, once everything was put out, of course, the state of emergencies is in. Many people who had taken the oaths in the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, it's actually noted that they used to have secret meetings in an Indian temple at River Road. Immediately after that, they all left Nairobi and they entered the forests at the Aberdares and Mount Kenya, around Mount Kenya, those forests. All of them left Nairobi. They were like, we're ready. Yeah.
And at the same time, we had those who had gone into the forest and they were now being mobilized by different leaders at different places and turned into soldiers for the cause. But then we also had people outside the forest who were mobilizing things like weapons, things like food supplies. We talked about this actually in season 1, where Piogama Pinto was known to be one of the suppliers of food and weapons to the
Yeah.
Mau Mau in the forest.
JM being a
JM
liaison.
as well, being
Yeah.
a liaison officer for the Mau Mau. So you can kind of see how the entire countryside came together to fight against a common cause in very different and meticulous ways. But then when we go back to what life looked like at that point for people, the settlers were scared. Maybe I could say they were scared, like they were shaking in their boots is the best way to put it. They
Yeah.
were definitely scared. There's reports of white settlers taking up arms on their own and learning how to shoot guns. There's also, it's important to note that the settlers were just as culpable for the violence that was meted out as
Yeah.
much as the government. There is, it was noted by Littleton, it was noted by the government offices back in Britain, it was also noted by Baring that the settlers were more of a threat to the people of Kenya than the Kenyan people were to the settlers.
Yeah, definitely.
But this was not what was, of course, said out.
and
loud.
portrayed, yeah.
It was portrayed that these people were bloodthirsty savages. They were vicious. They were cunning. They were also linked to being vermin. They were called animals and barbarians. And one historian noted that the dehumanization of the enemy is where the acceptance of certain things that we're going to be talking about later on in the season, such as detention camps, such as the de-oathing, such as the gruesome tactics that are employed later, are justified. And to quote maybe just Carolyn Elkins from Britain's Gulag,
Gulag.
she says that after journalist Anthony Sampson observed the dehumanization of the enemy by local settlers and colonial officials, it came to the point where thus Mau Mau became, for many whites in Kenya, and for many Kikuyu loyalists as well, what the Armenians had been to the Turks, the Hutu to the Tutsi, the Bengalis to the Pakistanis, and the Jews to the Nazis. As with any incipient genocide, the logic was all too easy to follow. Mau Mau adherents did not belong to the human race. They were diseased, filthy animals who could infect the rest of the colony and whose very presence threatened to destroy Kenya's civilization. They had to be eliminated. And this was bolstered by two very prominent attacks by the Mau Mau. There was hope that it wouldn't go into an all-out war, like you said, that it would just be, oh yeah, people are hacking each other somewhere and shooting each other somewhere, and we're going to resolve it. It's going to be fine. That didn't happen. That did not happen. So the Mau Mau decided to take over and raid a Naivasha police station. And what they did there was basically loot the entire armory and release about 200 Mau Mau prisoners. Immediately following that, it's something we talk about in our later episodes, but the Larry massacre takes place. And at that point, it's very clear that the emergency, the trials, and the war being waged in the forests cannot be stopped at this point without blood being shed on both sides.
Yeah, that's all we have for you today. Please join us in the next episodes where we'll be talking about what actually happened during the state of emergency. What was life like, even for the common Mwananchi? Remember to follow us on all our socials, leave a comment, share this with your friend, and as always, stay curious.
And as always, all our links will be available. All our sources will be available in the descriptions, and we will always be sharing our sources also on our social media. In case we've missed anything out, in case there's anything we may have lost in translation or in terms of research, please do let us know. And we look forward to bringing you more of this history in the next episode. Thank you so much.